Hello, world. Welcome to the Speed Strength Show. I'm Tommy.
And I'm Braden. And cereal is soup. Thoughts?
Man, you're right. It is. I've never thought of it that way. It's liquid in a bowl with fillings.
What else do you need?
Is there any definition around soup and the temperature? Because
You
cereal
can
is
have,
often cold because it's with milk that was refrigerated. So,
it is often cold, but there are cold soups and there is hot cereal.
what's an example of a cold soup?
I'm not a soup guy, so I
Okay,
can't
well,
really
I was
tell
going
you.
to say, I feel like I'm sounding really uncultured by saying what's a soup that's served cold, but I don't think I've ever had a cold soup.
Yeah, there definitely is, but yeah, I'm not a soup guy, and I'm definitely not a cold soup guy other than cereal, of course. Big cereal fan, but
I've never thought of it that way.
yeah,
That's brilliant.
yeah. I guess I'm also just kind of leaning into my tidbit every week is going to be food related.
I mean, there's nothing
So
wrong with that.
yeah, that's what I know. You know.
But no, I've never thought of cereal falling in the soup category, but
Yeah.
it definitely is. It's almost exactly the same.
Especially if you
Spoon,
like.
bowl, liquid, other ingredients put in the liquid.
hmm And you can like mix a couple cereals together. You can put some like fruit in it, or some sugar on top. You know, you get that soup. That's all
Maybe
you need.
put crackers in the soup or whatever.
Yeah. Are you a cereal guy?
No, not really.
Hmm. That doesn't surprise me.
I transitioned over to I eat a lot of oatmeal.
Yeah.
Love oatmeal.
hmm
And I mean, depending on how you make your oatmeal, maybe it falls in the soup category. I don't make it. I think it's like if it's porridgey, I don't really like it. I prefer the thicker, heavier texture to the
Yeah.
oatmeal.
Same. Same.
Um, I don't want it to be this kind of like soupy mess that falls off the spoon. But the same idea that you can fill it with other stuff, and yeah, I just prefer oatmeal. But growing up as a kid, big cereal fan.
Yeah.
Every single day for breakfast, cereal,
Mm.
cereal, cereal.
Yeah. Man. What was your fave?
That's a tough call. Captain Crunch is definitely up there.
Hmm.
Captain Crunch is such a good cereal. It's terrible for you. It's awful. But the other one that I liked, I don't know why I liked it so much, was I think it was a Kellogg cereal and it came in a dark green box. And I think it was called like Just Right or something. It was supposed to be like a healthy cereal, but it did not taste like a healthy cereal. There was just
Hmm.
something about it. It was like it was sweet. So that's maybe like my underrated pick. But like if you told me right now, Tom, you need to eat a bowl of cereal, what do you want to eat to enjoy it? Probably Captain Crunch.
Hmm. Right on.
What are your go-to choices?
Well, so I'm gluten free, right? Celiac
Oh,
and all.
true.
So my cereal choices have been somewhat limited, but they're growing in number lately. Um,
Is that
Chex,
because gluten-free is becoming more popular?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, definitely. But Chex is a really good gluten-free cereal brand, and specifically they have a cinnamon flavor that has been delicious lately, and I have it on good authority that it's not dissimilar from Cinnamon Toast Crunch. Um,
I
so
like how you
that's
said that
been
with good authority.
Yeah, that's been good lately. My underrated pick actually is Kellogg's has a brown Rice Krispie that is gluten free, and I honestly don't know why I like that one a lot. Like it's not sweet at all,
Yeah.
uh, but it's yeah, I don't know. It's got just this like hearty carbiness that I enjoy. I don't know, but huge cereal fan. I don't eat a lot lately, but I would like to eat more. It's just I reach for eggs and bacon in the morning these days.
But yeah, I think you like cereal the same way that I like oatmeal.
Hmm.
Like I think you could probably have cereal every single day.
I could have cereal 3 times a day.
Okay. I don't know if I would eat oatmeal 3 times a day, but at least like I eat oatmeal every single morning
Hmm.
for breakfast. I just change what goes in it.
Hmm.
And I have like 7 or 8 different combos and mixtures that I use. So then I don't get
Wow.
bored of like eating the same oatmeal every single day. I'm not trying to be that person.
Wow. Chef Tommy, 8 different
No,
oatmeal recipes.
no. Well, I mean, by recipe, it's as simple as
Yeah.
like, putting this fruit in instead of that fruit or
I
something
don't
like
know,
that.
man. You add the right ingredients at the right times, get the right consistency, the right textures, balanced flavors. Chef Tommy. That's what it sounds like to me.
Balanced flavors is kind of loose because I just throw stuff in there haphazardly. There's no measuring. It's not like I'm putting in 2 cups of this or 1 cup of that. It just that looks like enough cinnamon. That's
Fair
enough
enough.
cocoa.
I think that's how chefs do it, man. It's by feel. Cooks follow the recipe. Chefs improvise. Chefs make their own.
Oh wow. We need to change the podcast now. It needs to become a cooking show.
Mm, very good. Very good. All right. Well, we promised the audience round 2
We did.
of weakness assessment. I think that's what we called it last time.
Yeah, something along the lines of that.
Mm-hmm. So, if you're in the audience and you didn't hear last week's episode, I recommend checking that one out before checking this one out, because we'll be building upon that. And it was also a really great discussion. So go do that, and we'll see you in an hour, I guess.
Yeah, it was roughly an hour.
Mm-hmm.
So can
Yeah.
tune back in after.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But yeah, we wanted to get a little bit more specific this week. And I think you wanted to break things down, like as the stages of the race.
Yeah, like
How
I thought
things
it's
look
an
different.
opportunity for us to kind of go specific with some of the stuff and give people a little bit more from a sprinting context so we can cover the start. What are you looking for? Cover the acceleration portion of the run and the sprint portion of the run later on once you're upright. And then with
Mm-hmm.
you being able to get more specific with the exercises like squat, dead, bench, and actually be able to take something away of, next time I'm working with an athlete and they're doing deadlifts or they're squatting, is there something I can use, the next time
Mm-hmm.
I'm coaching or working with those people and take something away from this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. For sure. All right. Well, I know I'm curious to see. You mentioned a little bit about how the non-negotiables don't change for you throughout the race, but there are
Not
some
heavily, no.
different like exceptions maybe that you'll make at different times in the race. But yeah, I'm curious to see like what I guess weaknesses you'll notice at the beginning of the race versus like in the start, in the acceleration, in the upright. And if you'll see the same thing carry through the whole race. Yeah.
You'll definitely see things change because the demands change
Mm-hmm.
on the person as the positions change. So that's the interesting part, is that where you start to see some potential faltering or weakness
Mm.
will probably indicate the underlying issue based on where it happens in the race. So, but yeah, definitely it does change a little bit as, some errors that you see at the start will often be rooted in a different cause than errors you see in upright running
Interesting.
because
So
the
you'll
demands are
see,
different.
right. So depending on an athlete's competence or capacity, you'll see them be very good at the start, or very good at Excel, or very good at upright sprinting. Or vice versa, depending on, what they're capable of. Does that also, I imagine somebody who's better at upright sprinting might be more suited to a 400 or a 300 or a 200 versus a 100 or a 60. And someone who's better at a start or Excel would be more suited to a 60 or a 100.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, you need to be able to run upright because that's the most important part.
Mm-hmm.
And usually the person who hits the fastest top speed wins the race.
Mm-hmm.
So whether it's the 100 or the 400 or the 200, you need to be good at running upright. Typically, what'll then separate a 100 from a 200 to a 400, 800 is how fast you can actually run it upright.
Mm.
So someone who's maybe, very fast but doesn't have a lot of capacity is going to be better in the one. Someone who does have a lot of speed but can stretch it out a little bit further then might be the better candidate for the 2 or the 4 or something like that. So the relative speed demands drop as the distance goes up.
Mm. Yeah, that makes
So
sense.
that's kind of more like where you would see some of that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to get started? Do you want to
Yeah,
kick
man.
this off or?
Oh, yeah, sure. Um, yeah, sure. I guess we can start with the squat. We talked about that at length last time.
Yeah.
Um,
Squat will be good because it'll lead into the start pretty nicely.
oh, is that right?
Yeah, I like the idea of that.
All right.
You'll
I'm
see where I'm
interested to
going
see
with it.
how. Yeah, I'm interested to see how you pull off that transition. But yeah, we talked about last time the non-negotiables. We're terming them as that middle of the Venn diagram. Consistent across the board with everybody pretty much that squats and looks at a squat as being back flat, feet flat, which I fully agree. I did want to get more detailed with that. There are that encompasses pretty much everything, but there are more specific things that you might look at somebody and says, "Oh, their back's flat. It's probably good," but they could be in a little bit more extension than you would like, which is actually very, very common. I would say I would say maybe like 75% of competitive powerlifters and like 95% of consistent gym goers squat in excessive extension. And I would say for most people, that's fine. I don't think it's the strongest they could be, but I think for most people, it's okay. And then for a, not large, but notable percentage of people, that kind of thing can cause injury in like the facet joints or SI joint, things like that. So that ends up being something that we need to change with, cueing, core bracing, and various abdominal exercises. That's probably the most common one. I don't think it's a huge issue, but it's the most common for sure in squatting. And then we talked about knee stability last time as well, where we want the knees tracking generally over the toes. Again, it's going to depend on your anatomy. But a good stable squat is not going to have an excessive amount of valgus or an excessive amount of varus. So that's going to be something that we want to address, as well. It's kind of like we said, the feet flat, back flat is like your tier 1 kind of thing. We'll definitely make changes to address that.
If you want to
And
dive
these other,
deeper, it would be these other things.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So if you've mastered the feet flat, back flat thing, like you're a competent squatter, you're safe you can add load to that. You can progress with that. You don't need to dedicate all of your time to fixing technical issues or strength deficiencies or whatever.
Mm.
You can continue to get better at squatting, and you don't have to shy away from anything if you can do those things. If someone squats an extension, I'm not going to tell them to, you can't ever squat again unless you can do a neutral back goblet squat. Then you can go to the bar. Then you can, keep going from there. It's going to be, a work in progress, and you'll dedicate a, certain amount of time to fixing that issue, but it's something that you can continue to work on, continue to get better with. It doesn't need to be something that you drop everything and fix. Same with the knee valgus. It depends, I guess, on the amount, but there are a lot of, especially female powerlifters that squat with a lot of valgus when things get heavy and never have any issues because of it. Um, and if there are issues that come up, they're usually not related to the valgus anyway. So not a huge issue, but it's more of a efficiency issue. Um, both of those things are indicators of like a weakness or a deficiency somewhere else. Um, if you're squatting in a lot of extension, your rectus abdominis is not super strong. Your glutes aren't super strong. And so your back is taking a lot of the load to compensate for those issues. Same idea with the knee valgus. If your glutes aren't strong, you're going to rely a lot on the adductors, especially at the bottom of your squat, to help you come up. So you're going to get, with that hip extension from the adductors, you're going to get a lot of valgus as well. Yeah. And then I guess the other really common one is hip shooting, which I mentioned last time, where your hips shoot back out of the bottom of the squat.
Yeah, it's almost like someone's trying to turn it into a hinge.
Exactly. It goes
Yeah.
from a squat to a good morning, which people refer to it as a good morning squat all the time, which is shifting the weight off of your weak quads at the bottom to your stronger hip extensors or your stronger back. Which, yeah, it's super common. Most people, their hip extensors are stronger than their quads. And so it's not wrong to squat that way. I wouldn't tell someone to like lower the weight as far as you need to so that you can squat perfectly without any shifting. But it's another thing that's like widely agreed that this is more efficient. So if we can get closer to that, then that will be stronger.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of, these things are more indicators of what in our squat is the weakest link. We still want to play to our strengths. So if shifting back out of the bottom of the squat allows you to lift more weight, then you got to do that. You can't avoid that. The whole point is to lift as much weight as possible.
Yeah, it's a constraint of the sport.
Exactly. But the idea is that if squatting without a hip shoot is theoretically more efficient, then we need to strengthen the thing that will help us get closer to that. Some people don't have a hip shoot, but they have an excessive amount of knee valgus. So then they need to work more on their glute strength and things like that. Some people don't have a hip shoot, but they squat on a lot of extension. So they need to work more on, maybe upper back strength or abdominal strength, things like that. So, yeah, that's kind of, going one layer deeper in things that we don't need to change, but are indicators of things to work towards, I guess, is a good way to describe it.
Yeah. Yeah, the reason why I think it's kind of interesting that you talk about the squat is because I think a lot of people use the squat as a strength tool, right? We use it. We want to make athletes, people we work with, stronger, especially in the lower body. So we kind of default to the squat as that big lower body exercise, and it pairs nicely with the start, because if we look at starting mechanics, whether this is a track athlete, team sport athlete, someone who just wants to get faster, doesn't matter. The biggest deficit that we'll see from a physical standpoint is somebody lacking the strength. And that's probably the biggest physical detriment that you see, because we're at rest, we're not moving. The ground contact is the longest that it's going to be of any step as we're accelerating out to begin the run. So the time that we have to apply force and the amount of force that we have to apply in order to overcome inertia and get moving is highest at the start, and then gets less and less as we start to build momentum. So one of the things you'll commonly see from a physical detriment standpoint with individuals at the start is the lack of strength or maximal strength to be able to properly overcome the inertia, particularly with younger athletes, people who have never lifted before, if they don't have exposure to that type of work. So that's definitely something where if you're working with somebody and they seem to lack that that pop or the ability to cover ground on that first step, hitting the weight room can be a huge help for those individuals because it helps us build the strength and the ability that we need to generate the force to overcome inertia and get moving. So that's definitely something that I think helps improve somebody at the start because they need that strength to overcome it.
Yeah, you see, especially with younger athletes or less experienced athletes, that the strength is the main limiting factor in all forms of athleticism.
Mm.
Really, like getting stronger means you get faster, means you get more agile, it means you get all these things as well.
And then on the other side, if you look at the sort of the technical side of it, so what's the positioning? How are they setting up their body? I think one of the biggest things to watch for is where are the angles of the shins. So are they setting up in a way that has their shins pointed towards the direction they want to go? Are their shins vertical? Right? So if we see somebody set up and their shins are pointing forward, that's going to allow them to actually project up and out, which is the way that we would want to go. If somebody sets up and their shins are closer to vertical, that's when you're going to see that person pop up and become extremely vertical at the start and not actually push out and cover ground. So from a technical standpoint, making sure that their feet and shins are actually positioned in a way where their feet are under their hips to actually generate the force to get out, or the front foot is under the hip and the shins are pointed forward, would then allow them to actually point and push themselves in the right direction. So if you're working with somebody, one of the easiest things you can do, for example, is put them in a 4-point position on the ground, like a tabletop, as if they were going to do a crawl or a bird dog or something like that. And then you want their knees under their hips. So knees and hips are stacked. Shoulders and hands are stacked. And then whatever foot they want to come forward with to start, you just tuck that foot beside the knee and underneath the hip. And then that would position their feet, if you wanted to do like a 3-point start, for example, in a good spot where then when they bring the hips up, their shins are pointed in the direction you want to go. Their front foot is underneath the hip to actually help project them out. So if you did that and what you can do is you can set somebody up in that position. And if they come out well, then you know, okay, it was a cognitive or a technical thing. They didn't understand what they had to do. If they're continuing to have difficulty with getting out, then you may need to take the longer term approach and address the strength concern. And so if you are dealing with somebody with that strength concern, one of the things that you can do is bring them up to a higher starting position. So a 4-point position on the ground is going to be the hardest to come out of because it requires the most strength. A 2-point position, or even a 2-point with a bit of a walk in or a roll in, is going to be much easier for someone who's not very good at starting because it gives them a bit of momentum and it's going to help put them in the right positions that they need to be in. So one of the things you could do is that if it's a technical problem, just address it right there and then and give them some reps to figure it out. If it does look like it's an underlying strength issue, bring them up to a higher position to do their starts. We still need to work on it. We still want to address it. You don't want to scrap those sessions altogether, but bring them up to a higher position so they can actually be in a position they're strong enough to be in to perform the movement correctly. And then as they make the adaptations in the weight room and make the morphological changes in their muscle, then try to bring them back to a lower start position. So, but yeah, those are some of the common things you see at the start is from a physical standpoint, it's that lack of strength. And being in the weight room can do wonders for a lot of those people, especially youth athletes.
Mm-hmm. That's really cool I just imagine as we go deeper down this rabbit hole that we'll just keep seeing all these different I wasn't expecting to see so many similarities already between the start and the squat, and then how you address some of the issues is very similar to how I would address some of the issues in a deadlift, actually.
Oh, is that where we're going next?
I think maybe that's where we're going next. But
Nice.
with the squat, so we see um, like a hip shift back, you know, which you can call a hip shoot, you can call a chest fall. Um, but the biggest thing that I look for actually is where the knees are tracking, because naturally, as you stand up in the squat, your hips are going to move, your hips are going to come up. We don't want them to come back necessarily, but they're going to come up, so sometimes that can look like a hip shoot anyway. Um, but if the knees shoot back really fast, stop, and then go back a little bit further as they lock out, that's very indicative of that hip shoot pattern, versus somebody who doesn't have that or is squatting with a light enough weight that they don't have that. It is a very smooth back. It's not like go, stop, and then go again. Um, and it sounds like, so in that instance, it's their quads are not strong enough to be in that position. So they need to shift the weight to muscles that are stronger.
Mm.
And it sounds like that's exactly what happens with sprinters in their start. If they're not strong enough to be in a position with their shins and their torso at the same angle, where they can push out, they shift and their knees, drift back, their hips drift up, and they're still in that bent over position. So it is very interesting to
Yeah,
hear you
like
talk
basically
about
what
that.
you'd see is a strong individual, for example, could shoot out at like a 40-degree angle.
Hmm.
Someone who's not very strong, not a good sprinter, maybe isn't, coordinated enough or whatever, is not going to be able to maintain that position. They want to be in a
Hmm.
more upright position. So yeah, they will. That's why you see people kind of pop up at the start if they're
Hmm.
not very strong, because they don't have the strength or the force development ability to actually maintain that aggressive forward lean. So they just adapt it by coming up taller in a position
Yeah.
where they can actually apply the force.
Yeah.
And
That's.
yeah, it's exactly you're describing. It's a compensation in position for
Mhm.
some sort of a lack of whatever the underlying weakness is.
Hmm. Yeah, no, that's really cool. Because yeah, a strong individual in this case, with the quads anyway that are strong enough, would just be coming straight up with their hips and their shoulders rising together,
Mhm.
versus the hips coming up first and then the shoulders coming up later. Is how that compensation looks. Um, and then the other thing that reminds me of the deadlift, when you talked about starting in that higher position where they are capable of producing the force in that
Mhm.
position. Um, a very common thing actually to address a glute issue in either the squat or the deadlift, because your glutes are basically the more hip extension you get into, and I think that's why you maybe one of the reasons you see that issue as well. The more hip flexion, that you get into, they are less and less capable of producing force, in terms of like leverage, but also activation and things like that. Which is why you have your adductors to produce force in those low positions. Um, but one of the things that we do to address a glute strength issue is raise them up. So I'll have people squat to pins that are higher. So there's, instead of squatting all the way to depth, they'll squat like 3 or 4 inches above parallel. Or we'll do like block deadlifts, for example, just to raise them up, start in a little bit more hip extension, and then have an easier time using the glutes and not have to have those compensation patterns to complete the lift.
Well, yeah, and you have them do the movement properly,
Hmm.
right? At the end of the day.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, that's the thing. Like, I would rather set somebody up in a higher position and start and accelerate properly than try to force them into a low position
Hmm.
and have them perform a poor quality first step.
So I was going to ask you, would you, because you're going to be sprinting a few times a week at least, um, would you have them always starting in that taller position and just kind of gradually lower them down? Or would you have, 50% of the time you're starting in that taller position and the other 50% you're starting in like a normal, on the ground position out of the blocks or whatever?
I'll normally start them in the higher position, then we'll work towards the lower position
Mhm.
One of the unfortunate constraints that we deal with is, at least from a sport perspective with track, is you need to be prepared to use the blocks.
Mhm.
So even if somebody is, too weak, let's say, to use the blocks, at some point we have to introduce the blocks. We have to put them in a 4-point because the sport requires them to start the race in the blocks. So, we'll try to, or at least I'll try to get away with using those 2 or 3-point higher positions to do the starts and teach good starts to individuals. But at some point it's like, well, if we didn't get there because we didn't get strong enough or we didn't have enough time to address the technical issue, we have to get them in the blocks at some point,
Mhm.
to prepare them for competition. If it's an athlete who's not in track and field, then yeah, we can take, you know, a lot of time. There was a baseball kid, for example, I was working with this past year, and we probably spent 4 or 5 months doing starts and excels from 2-point positions and just kept building on it, getting him stronger, doing things like that because, well, he wasn't a track athlete. So we didn't have to force him into a 4-point position. And to be honest, the starting positions he'll use in baseball are different anyway. So it's really going to depend on the context. But those would be 2 examples of kind of maybe different paths that you would take.
Mhm. Yeah, that's cool. Are there like specific go-to strength things that you'll do in the gym? Like obviously this is how you'll learn how to do a proper start when you aren't strong enough to do a proper start. Um, but like in the gym, are there specific things that you keep going back to target um, like those strength issues?
To be honest, I don't think it matters. If
Mm-hmm.
it's a big lower body lift, I think it's going to help.
Mm-hmm.
So if you like to squat, squat them. If you like to deadlift, you could deadlift them. If you think that single leg variants are better than double leg variants, then use a rear foot elevated split squat or a single leg RDL or hip thrusters or anything like that. I don't think there's, especially with younger athletes or people who lack the strength, it's a means to an end. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it matters what you do to develop the strength as long as you are doing something that is taxing the lower body from a strength standpoint. So you're probably limited with some of your options because you do need to be able to load this up eventually. But yeah, whether you want to lunge, squat, hip thrust, deadlift, RDL, it's going to address the muscles that you need um, to be strong in order to project yourself out of that position.
Do you ever see anybody like, so we talked about it in my case, uh, you can have strong quads and squat, very upright, but you'll run into a different weakness essentially, or you can have very strong glutes, back, hamstrings, whatever, and squat a different way. And obviously you have the hip shoot weakness. Um, do you see people with like, does I guess the ratio of like quad strength to hip extensor strength, does that affect the start at all, or do you just need strength somewhere essentially?
I mean, you definitely need a little bit more quad strength
Mm-hmm.
because the quads, more so in the start than anywhere else in the race, will help project
Mm-hmm.
you forward. As we're later on, as you start to get more and more upright, the quads are used more from a stabilization standpoint when your foot contacts the ground. But most of the force is being generated by the glute and the hamstrings
Mm-hmm.
with the violent extension of the leg driving down into the ground. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why people like to use the squat the most, or some sort of quote unquote lower body push to help address the start, because you're probably a little more dependent on the quad in the start relative to anywhere else in the run,
Mm-hmm.
because it starts to transition from a means of kind of force generation and extending and pushing the ground away into more of a stabilizing the foot and stabilizing the limb for contact.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You see the same kind of thing, obviously coming out of the bottom of a squat or off of the floor and a deadlift, you're going to see a lot more quad activation. And a lot of the hip extension is going to be coming from the adductors at that point because the glutes aren't as capable. And then closer to the top, you see that shift from the quads to the glutes or to the adductors or to the hamstrings. Ideally, it's the glutes because with the adductors and the hamstrings, they have other functions other than hip extension. So you get some of that valgus with the adductors. And sometimes, if you shift to the hamstrings, you can see if you've ever seen like a really heavy deadlift and people start to shake on the way up
Oh, all the time.
and
Yeah,
like
I've seen
their
those.
knees are like vibrating,
Yeah.
that's their quads and their hamstrings are fighting each other because the hamstrings are trying to do hip extension, but they also do knee flexion, right? And so the quads are doing knee flexion, trying to keep that going up, and so the hamstrings and quads are going back and forth,
Okay, that
which
makes sense.
is pretty interesting. Yeah. But that's so keeping that in mind, we try to choose exercises that will emphasize, where is this muscle actually able to do the work? Quads, if you want to hit the quads, you got to go deep. And like research shows that adding a lot of weight to your quads, essentially, you don't get that much more activation or hypertrophy by adding more weight. But if you go deeper and you keep the load on your quads, that's when you're getting a lot of benefit. Deeper meaning more knee flexion, essentially. So we typically choose like front squat variants or like high bar variants because a lot of our lifters will squat low bar. So being a little bit more upright means a little bit deeper, a little bit more knee flexion. And then you just got to be careful that you're making sure that your knees stay forward. You're not letting them shoot back and then shifting the weight onto the hips. And then, to hit glutes, then we're, obviously starting higher and adding a lot more weight because they respond better to weight.
Yeah.
So then you're going to choose in those cases, it's going to be variants that make it easier to hit glutes and ideally avoid adductors and hamstrings. So block deadlifts is a favorite. And then, in terms of like accessory movements, I really like hip thrusters. And
It's a great
I've just
exercise.
started. Yeah, I've just started to use a kneeling good morning. And already having the bent knee means that your hamstrings are going to be less involved. So those are big ones. And then anything with a mini band around the knees I like as well to kind of give a little bit extra stimulus.
Okay, one thing I'm curious with the deadlift is, okay, you have conventional and you have sumo.
Mm-hmm.
And correct me if I'm wrong, you're likely selecting one over the other in powerlifting because you want to pick the one where you can move the most weight because that's how you win. I don't see many people using sumo deadlift from like a training standpoint or a general all-purpose standpoint. So what's some of the big differences, I guess, from a fundamental or an underlying movement standpoint that makes the sumo different from the conventional deadlift? And is there a case where when you're working with athletes who are not powerlifters and are in another sport or general pop, where you would make a case for one over the other because of the movement qualities it brings to the table?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, obviously, the stance is going to be the big thing that's different. So the sumo deadlift is going to be, you could imagine it closer to like a wide stance squat. So you're going to be sitting your hips a little bit lower. Your knees are going to be a little bit more forward. So you're going to have a little bit more quad demand and a little bit less hip extension demand because your hips are closer to the bar, and less like shear force on your back. From a physical standpoint, that's going to be what you'll see. Sumo deadlift is typically going to require a little bit more mobility, like hip mobility. Those are the big ones. And sumo's requires a little bit more technical proficiency as well. You can do it takes a lot of skill to do a good conventional deadlift, and it takes a lot of skill to do a good sumo deadlift. But um, I think sumo, when you get heavy, requires more focus.
Interesting.
Um, yeah, um, yeah, and for like the the reasons for selecting one over the other is going to be largely, well, it's going to be partially like where are you stronger. So if you're stronger in your hip extensors, then you're probably going to lean a little bit more towards the conventional deadlift. If you're stronger in your quads, then you're going to lean a little bit more towards your sumo. Strong quads and strong hip extensors are going to help you in both cases, so it doesn't matter that much. Um, you're probably going to look more at the mobility. And if someone has the hip mobility to get into a really good sumo position, then you're probably going to look there. And if someone does not have that hip mobility, then the conventional is probably going to be a better option. Um, for people with more extreme leverages, like there's deadlifter leverages where you have long arms essentially and a short torso. That's going to help you in either case. So like a lot of the things that you look for are going to apply to both a sumo and a conventional. Um, but the big ones that'll separate people would be the hip mobility and potentially torso length, um, because people with super long torsos sometimes can't get into a good conventional position. Um, Either their shoulders are way in front of the bar, or the bar's away from their shins, or they're rounded, or like sometimes that happens. So being able to play a little bit more with where you put your hips, you can do that in a sumo. You have more variability, more freedom. Um, so you can typically get them into a little bit of a better position in a sumo if they have the hip mobility for it. Um, Sometimes you just don't, and sometimes people are forced to be in a bad position, and it sucks. So you do a lot of work off blocks because it's safer. Um, but yeah, those are the big ones. Um, yeah, and then like technically, most of the things you're thinking about stay the same. So at the end of the day, a deadlift's a deadlift, but it's going to depend more on your anatomy, um, where you start if you're a new person, and if you've been competing, then you just whichever one's stronger, just keep doing that. So
Yeah, it's
yeah,
just interesting from a training standpoint because if at the end of the day, if it's not a power lifter where the numbers that they lift don't matter and it's a means to an end,
mm-hmm.
then is there a case where maybe you want to use conventional over sumo, maybe you want to use sumo over conventional, but just an interesting thing I think to bring up because then maybe it opens up the toolbox for people to, oh, maybe in this scenario I would use a sumo deadlift instead of a conventional, or here I'd use a conventional deadlift instead of a sumo, based on what it is that they're trying to accomplish in their training.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think if there's no issues on the table, then you'll probably want to lean towards like if we're assuming it's an athlete, um, you'll want to lean more towards a conventional deadlift because chances are if you're choosing deadlift, you want hip extension and you
Mm,
want back strength, and if you want quad strength, then go squat.
yeah,
Um, so that's probably where you're going to lean. But, if they can't get into a good conventional position, then, you want to try sumo. Um, if they can lift a lot more weight, sumo, then you're probably going to do a better job developing your hip extensors anyway. So sumo's probably the move. If they got a bad back, sumo's probably the move, or trap bar or something like that. Um, if they've got bad hips, that's something that's very common in sumo pullers. People have, they will injure their hips more often than they injure their back pulling sumo.
mm,
Um, so then you want to try conventional probably if that's the case. So yeah, those are some things to consider. But um,
good insight there
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
for sure.
Um, how often like with the rolling starts,
Mm.
you mentioned that a little while ago, um, as something that can kind of help people overcome their strength issues. Is that like, do you use that kind of by itself? Is it kind of like an intermediary between like a higher start position and a lower start position? Um,
Well, the walking or the rolling is just to get a little bit of momentum,
mhm,
right? So you might be walking up to the line, and then you take a little hop up, and then boom, and then go forward. So it's just to help, kind of overcome maybe some of the deficiencies. If you still want to do some acceleration or starting work, but you don't want to put them in a super low, kind of unfavorable position, then it gives them a little bit more momentum or spring into their steps, so they don't have to deal with that um, like stationary inertia that they have to overcome to help them kind of
mhm.
move forward. So again, it's just a tool in the toolbox.
Yeah.
Um, and that one kind of blends. You could use it as a starting tool, acceleration tool. Start and acceleration are kind of together anyway.
Mhm,
Because very rarely would you just work on like one step and then shut it down.
mhm,
You're always going to move into other steps. But yeah, it changes the momentum for
mhm.
the athlete
That's interesting because I
in their
think that's
favor.
one. Yeah, I think that's one that is very common. If you look at like speed coaches or strength coaches for sport, um, one thing that people use a lot and you see a lot in media or whatever if you're watching stuff. But I feel like a lot of people don't know why they're doing it. It's just another thing that you can do. You know.
Yeah. Like I said, to me, the big thing is it provides them with momentum.
Mm-hmm.
So you can effectively hit good first step positions. You can hit good acceleration positions, but you don't have to go from a complete standstill. And depending on the sport, maybe that helps.
Mm-hmm.
A slot back in the CFL version of football, waggling, moving around at the line of scrimmage, you're hitting the line of scrimmage with a bit of that hop step, as where if you're, the Z receiver and you're starting in a stationary position, you need to be able to generate the strength from there. So, that's an example of maybe where you would need it. Um, you know, Different sports are on the move and things like that. So definitely helps teach people how to accelerate and start well with some previous momentum.
Yeah, that's interesting too. To think that in some cases it's not just a tool to develop starting strength or acceleration or what have you. That sometimes it is specific to the sport.
Exactly.
Yeah, Hmm. I never thought
Um,
about it like that.
yeah. And then as you move into, like, again, that drill kind of blends
Mm-hmm.
start and acceleration, which, like I said, is already kind of naturally blended together because it's really hard to have one without the other. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but the acceleration is where you get a bit of a blend of both. You're transitioning from that first aggressive step into the upright position. So as we talked about in the last episode, biggest thing we're looking for is, do the shins and the torsos, does the shin angle and the torso angle match? And if the shin and the torso angles match, then you're going to have efficient production of force into the ground. And are you rising gradually or smoothly with the movement that you're doing? So those are the things that we're looking for. And it can be a little bit tricky to identify the physical detriment, because if it's a little bit earlier in the acceleration, it might be more strength based because we're still spending a little bit more time on the ground. We're still needing to generate very high levels of force to build forward momentum. If it's a little bit later in the run where we start to come a little bit more upright and the contacts are shorter, it could be a rate of force development issue, because now we have limited amounts of time to put force into the ground. And that's the issue. So you would have to be able to figure out, when you're watching the athlete or the person you're working with accelerate, is it happening earlier in their acceleration or later in their acceleration? Because that would then indicate, okay, maybe we need to get a little stronger to help us continue to push and generate momentum early on, or maybe we need to improve rate of force development later in the acceleration run because we have more time constraints that we're dealing with. So the physical or the, you know, the muscle issues that you're dealing with could be one of two of those things. Typically what you'll see with, from a cueing standpoint, is people just don't understand what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So cueing them to rise smoothly. So I'll often use the analogy of, have they ever seen an airplane take off? Or have they ever been in an airplane when it takes off? And you're not just on the runway and then boom, up in the air. The plane gradually builds up speed, starts to come up, 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 and then it takes off. And so those changes in position that you have, we want it to be a smooth, gradual change. And sometimes that kind of concept helps give them context to what it is that they're trying to accomplish. So that can be a really good kind of cognitive or technical cue, is to describe it as an airplane with that smooth transition, or having them think about pushing out and up. Because a lot of the times you might see somebody really thinking about pushing up and then they shoot upright too quick. And that's when you'd see the people popping up in their acceleration, or they're here and then all of a sudden, boom, they're upright. And if you see somebody only pushing out, that's when we sort of talked about last week, that example of somebody running with their torso really far forward, but then their legs starting to cycle. And they have this forced, like, oh, I want to be down, I want to be low. And they kind of get into that error. So by having them push out and up, that actually helps them go into the direction that we want them to go. So that's an example of some like technical cues. There's a lot of cues out there that you could use, but that could help bring somebody into those positions. And I think one of the easiest ways to help teach people that is to use the hills. You could use sleds as well, but basically anything that's going to slow down the acceleration. Because if you can slow down the speed of the acceleration, it's going to be easier for that person to accomplish the positions and the postures, because it's easier to learn things at a slower speed. The reason I say the hills is because it's probably more accessible for most people. You don't need any equipment. You just need to have a hill somewhere nearby. But both of those sort of resisted forms of acceleration and sprinting would help teach the acceleration patterns, because it naturally slows it down, makes it easier for the person to accomplish those positions, but it's still high intensity. So the effort and the intent matches what we'll eventually go to. So it's not like we're slowing down the movement or bringing the intensity down. Then we're going to have an issue with, oh, that movement looks really good at 50%. And then it falls apart again when we get to 100. The intent and the effort is still 100%. We're just kind of playing around with the speed. So yeah, hills would be, to me, one of the easiest things to implement to improve the acceleration qualities of an athlete.
Yeah, that's cool. That's something that, I think a lot of people know. It's another thing that I think a lot of people know, where you need to kind of stay low through your acceleration until you get to upright sprinting. But I think a lot of people don't know why, and don't know specifically what they're looking for. It is interesting that another parallel I'm seeing between, powerlifting and sprinting is that you have the start, which is kind of one thing, and upright sprinting, which is kind of another thing. And you've got this transition zone that's a little bit both, but it's a little bit its own thing as well.
Yeah.
And you see that in the squat. Well, you see that in all three lifts, honestly, where you have your bottom position as one thing, you have your top position as something else, and then your middle is like, it's kind of both, but it's kind of its own thing as well. And for us, that's where we see, that's the sticking point, honestly. It's not,
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it, actually.
What's that?
That the sticking point and acceleration are kind of they're parallels.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think they absolutely are.
That's a really good point.
And the sticking point in powerlifting is basically you have one group of muscles doing something, and then you have another group of muscles doing something, and you're going from a position where one is really strong to a position where the other is really strong, and in the middle neither of them are really that strong, and that shifting of the emphasis or the force or the activation that's when you slow down. um, and it sounds like it's kind of the same thing, not necessarily a little bit in terms of what muscles are doing the work, but also the skills that the muscles need to have. You mentioned like strength, pure like maximum strength in the quads at acceleration or at the start, sorry. And then the quick force production in the glutes and the hamstrings at, the top end speed. And that middle is kind of the transition in between, which I think is a really interesting parallel.
Yeah, like I said, that's such a good point that you bring up, because I've never thought about acceleration as like the quote unquote sticking point in that same way, but it really is, because it's the pathway from, okay, I'm doing this thing at the start,
Mm-hmm.
and now I need to find my way into this other position. And it really is the pathway from one to the next that leads you to there. But that idea of it being the sticking point, I like that. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's a novel way of thinking about it. Um, so yeah, like I really do like that point.
Mm-hmm. There's also kind of another parallel when you mentioned like sometimes you'll see people struggle near the beginning of their acceleration, which is indicative of more of a strength issue. And sometimes they'll struggle towards the end of the acceleration, which is indicative of more of that, quick force production issue. And you see the same thing in powerlifting as well, where, we mentioned being weak at the bottom is like a quad thing, being weak at the top is like a glute thing. Um, and if someone's sticking point is lower, then chances are that's a quad thing. And if it's higher, chances are that's a hip extension thing. Um, so yeah, it's really cool to see those parallels anyway.
And they're so different in terms of like the sport.
Mm-hmm.
One is so slow and so heavy,
Mm-hmm.
and the other one is, the load is so low, but then the speed is so high. But even in those opposites, there's still a lot of things that are similar.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you want to touch on with the bench?
I think maybe that'll be a next week thing. I think that might have to be a next, because you have to talk about upright sprinting still.
I honestly don't care if it goes a little bit long. I mean, this has been pretty good discussion, so
All right,
I'm
let's
happy if
keep
you
it
want to
going.
talk about bench, and then I'll close out with talking a little bit upright, and then
Yeah. Well, there is actually one more, because you mentioned like the hills as something that slows down the sprint and
Mhm.
makes it easier to focus. Um, and that's something that we'll use a lot too. Is like tempo work. Um, and most of the time it'll be
Is this
tempo on the.
across the board? Sorry, with all exercise, like,
Yeah,
okay, I wasn't sure if you were referring to this to a specific exercise or more like globally.
yeah, globally for sure. We'll use tempo mostly on the way down, because the intensity for us most of the time is going to be on the way up. Um, but yeah, so we'll use it mostly on the way down, um, to slow things down, to help people focus on, you know, if they're struggling with their bracing and they're in a lot of extension, it gives them time to focus on pulling the ribs down. Is a good cue that we like to use in the squat. Um, same kind of thing in the bench press, which we'll get into. If they're having trouble bending the bar and keeping their, scapula depressed and, lats engaged, then slowing that down helps people have the time to focus on that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and, with the deadlift, there definitely is benefit to doing tempos on the way down to, practice keeping your back engaged, strong, neutral, and a little bit more control in loading the glutes as well. But when I use tempo in a deadlift, I'll more often than not, it's going to be on the way up actually, which is, again, it's something that I don't like to do. And I like to do other things before that hopefully will work better. Um, but if people are having a hard time being patient and getting that, shoulders and hips rising together, um, instead of having that hip shoot issue that we talked about with the squat. Same thing happens in the deadlift. Forcing people to go slow through that position, it forces them to do it well. Like, I don't know if you can imagine your hip shooting and you're rounding your back, but it's a 5-second concentric contraction like that. That's terrible.
Awful. That would be so bad.
That you don't want to do that.
Miserable.
So we'll look for like pause deadlifts, like pausing in that really low position just off the ground, to emphasize that strong position and that patience. But if they aren't understanding it, more often than not, that's a focus thing or a like people not understanding what they're supposed to do thing. The tempo is just killer to make them nail that. So, yeah.
Get another unexpected parallel, kind of. Right word. Yeah, it's a good point. It's the same thing. It's changing the speed of the movement to help them correct or alter the position.
Yeah, and then with the bench press, it's kind of the same theme where at the top of the lift, it's the triceps that are doing most of the work, and at the bottom of the lift, it's the pecs that are doing most of the work, slash front delts to an extent, with your upper back playing a more stability role, and depending on where the bar goes is going to tell you which one is stronger, essentially. So you want to see people talk about like a J pattern in the bench press. You've probably heard that before.
Yeah,
where the bar goes.
Yeah,
the bar goes up and then it goes back. That's actually like super inefficient. So if you see people in the gym,
even just looking at it, it's like,
yeah, right.
You think about,
because you've got. I hope people are watching the YouTube video so they can see what I'm about to do. Because in your bottom position, you've got the bars like, below your nipple essentially.
Yeah.
So if you press straight up from there, like the bar is so far below your shoulder and it needs to finish on top of your shoulder. Like if you're holding, 300 pounds horizontally, like 6 inches away from your shoulder, you're not going to be able to hold that position. Like it's a super, super weak position you're putting yourself
the more
in.
things are stacked, the more stable it's going to be.
Exactly. Right. So the most efficient bench press is one that gets you into that stacked position faster. So you see, instead of up and back, you see back and then up. And you kind of have like a reverse J situation. And if you see that, then someone's got like strong pecs. If someone has really weak pecs, you're going to see them push straight up, because it's going to be a lot of triceps that are assisting them on the way up. And you see that a lot in beginner lifters with stronger triceps, that the bar, if this is back, the bar is even going that way off the chest, which is a recipe for disaster. And you see like people maxing out, you'll see straight up a lot of the time, stick, drift straight back, and then up, and it's really interesting to see that. So depending on where the bar is going off the chest, you're either going to target pecs to get more of that efficient bar path. But then if people, start off really strong coming off the chest, but then can't lock it out, then that's obviously going to be a tricep thing.
I like that reverse J.
So then you'll choose exercises that target those different areas. Anything that's going to increase range of motion is going to hit more pecs, because pecs obviously do the work at the bottom.
Yeah.
So we're looking at like feet up bench press, like no arch bench press, anything like that. And anything that shortens range of motion is going to target more triceps. So like block bench press or like high pins, things like that. Our close grip bench does as well, for sure. I'm sure everybody who is listening knows that. But one specific instance where I'll choose close grip over everything else is if somebody has like excessive amounts of elbow flare off the chest, to the point where instead of having like this diagonal back and then up, it's like flat, then they probably want to be able to use a little bit more triceps off of the chest to kind of get just a slightly more vertical bar path. But yeah, those are the big ones for the bench press. The other
That's
one
gold.
actually, yeah,
That's
the other
gold.
one
That
actually,
reverse J thing is like, it
mm,
just makes sense. If you want to
yeah,
get from point A to point B, what's the easiest? It's not going all over the place. It's just get
yeah,
there.
yeah,
So get to the spot where you're going to be strong in as soon as you can, and then be
exactly,
strong. I
exactly.
love that.
And the same thing, like that's another one that people more often than not just don't understand what they're supposed to do. But you will see with younger lifters and female lifters more often than not having more of a tricep dominant bench press. And so targeting the pecs is going to be more beneficial for them. And not saying that they can't bench press more weight until they can have this reverse J. It's a work in progress kind of a thing. The only other thing that I wanted to touch on was the leg drive that I talked about last week. I promised the viewers that I would go into there's another kind of a niche thing that a lot of the big boys like to use.
Well, I mean, the bench press from a powerlifting standpoint, it's a whole body thing. Like if you're not doing what you're supposed to do with your lower limbs, you're leaving weight on the table.
Oh yeah, 100%. And for most people, that's exactly the case. Is you need like whole body stability, and the only thing that should be moving is your arms. Otherwise, you're leaking energy, you're leaking stability, and your like force that could be going into the bar is now being lost somewhere else. But one thing that some of the big bench pressers do is they let the bar sink into their chest, into their gut, instead of like keeping really tight and like stopping the bar as high on their chest as possible so that, they have a really short range of motion. They'll let it sink and let their legs relax a little bit so that when they get that press command, they can do like a really forceful quad extension into the ground and use their legs to produce more force.
It almost
like
leverage
slingshot.
Pop the bar out of.
Yeah, literally. Yeah. And they'll do so that quad extension, they'll like puff their gut,
Pop.
forcefully lift their chest up. And it's kind of, honestly, it's a little bit like triple extension. A little bit.
It's a rapid, forceful.
Yeah.
It's not a passive movement that they're doing. They are actively
it's
trying
super, and it's explosive. It's super, super fast. They're just all of a sudden like huge pop into the bar, lots of momentum that gets them going back. And then they can just carry that momentum, it's really cool to see someone do that skillfully. It takes some practice to master that, but
yeah, it's not a day one.
Yeah, it's not a day
one adventure for sure.
It's an interesting strategy to play around with anyway.
I've never seen that before. Again, this is just interesting. It's fascinating to hear. Like, and they use it in powerlifting, but is there a way that you can use it somewhere else? I mean, who knows? But if you don't know it exists, there's no way it's a tool in your toolbox.
Yeah,
so
it's kind of similar to like a push press. If you can imagine how the momentum transfer is in that, it's kind of the same thing.
I'm loving this though. There's, like I said, you're just tossing out gold everywhere.
Thanks, buddy.
So the bench press thing is super fascinating.
Yeah.
That's a lot of stuff I've never heard before. I mean, not a big bench guy myself, as you can tell.
Oh, I don't know. You hit 225.
But now that was one time. And then I stopped.
Counts. Part of the club.
But then now I'm excited to go back to bench. I'm going to have to try it again, see if I can add like 50 pounds onto my bench all of a sudden.
I mean, you'll be surprised.
Because I have all these
like some of this technical stuff. Some of the technical stuff, you'd be surprised how much it adds. But
strength is a skill, man.
It is.
So if you get better at the skill, you're going to be better.
It is. Yeah. And then I'm interested to hear about your upright sprinting. What changes there?
Yeah. So, I mean, at this point, again, the idea of torso vertical, shins vertical when we strike the ground, because again, we want to be efficient with our force production is huge. And that dorsiflexed foot kind of landing just in front of the hips or the center of mass is where we want to see that vertical force production happen. So from a physical standpoint, now because we're upright running, the contacts are super short. The rate of force development and the ability to produce force in a very small window of time becomes more important. So from a physical standpoint, if we really want to improve upright sprinting in terms of max velocity and running fast, we need to produce force quickly, and we need to be reactive off the ground. And then from a technical standpoint, we want to think about pushing tall. So one of the biggest errors that you'll see, and I talked a little bit about it last week, is spending a little bit too much time on the ground or getting a little bit like kind of ploddy with the steps, where you see somebody strike, the ground, and then you really see them push backside or push behind them. And that could be a sign. That could be one of two things. Either A, they lack the rate of force development, so they want to spend longer on the ground so they can actually apply the force. Or it could be because they don't have a technical understanding of what it is they need to do. So I think one of the best drills to put people in is you can either do some straight leg bounds into sprint, or you can go with wicket runs. And the reason I like these two is because they kind of force you into a good position. And then that allows you to start to see, does somebody, maybe they had the rate of force development quality, or maybe they had the qualities they needed. They just didn't understand the mechanics that they were trying to accomplish. So the straight leg run, somebody would start basically running forward with bounding with straight legs. And the reason I like this is because it allows us to be in a tall, upright position with the torso and the hips. And then all I'll ask the person to do is to start to bend their knees at some point. But we don't want to see the level of their hips or shoulders change. So then the only thing that changes is the lower body mechanics and the arm mechanics, but we've tried to set them up in a good up tall position. And so they can feel, oh yeah, I felt myself dip or drop when I got into that position. So then they can feel, okay, here's the tall position that I need to be in. The other thing too is that by taking away the acceleration at the beginning and starting them in a straight leg bound, they won't be carrying as much speed. So it's either safer to use, early on when you want to lower the intensity, or also just to help bring the speed down and make it easier to learn what they need to do with the movements. And then you don't need any equipment. The wicket runs are those, the little banana hurdles, the ones that are like 2 or 3 inches off the ground. You set those up at specified distances, and you have the athlete run, contacting the ground 1 foot between every single of those banana hurdles. And then what happens is that will help with the person needing to strike the ground down or pushing nice and tall, because they're worried the moment they touch down on the ground, they think I need to pick my foot back up so I don't spend too long on the ground and clip this banana hurdle. It also helps them to teach to get the thigh up and forward, because they don't want their foot to kick out and strike the next hurdle. So it really does a good job of naturally helping bring the foot back underneath the hip in a pretty rapid fashion. And then that's where you can start to see, okay, is the person struggling with the technique, or is the person struggling with their rate of force development? Oftentimes the technique is going to be off. So, starting with those drills kind of helps put them in a good position, but then we can start to see, okay, now that they've accomplished those positions, are we still seeing that lack of pop or force into the ground? So, trying some straight leg bounds to run, or the wicket runs, not just for track athletes, but for any athlete that needs to run, to teach them to be in good upright positions, makes it very easy as a coach too to teach it, because you just kind of need 1 or 2 cues, and then the drill kind of naturally puts them, the environmental constraints put them into good positions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
especially the wickets.
That's really, really cool. And that's another thing that I've never thought of. Obviously I'm not a huge track guy, but another one that's, I think a lot of people do it, and a lot of people know that it's something that helps you get fast, but they don't know why. and they don't know when to use that tool. And like it's another tool in the toolbox, and there's other things that can accomplish those goals. But
It's really a
that's really
technical
cool.
thing
Yeah.
because those
No,
things are going to restrict the speed. So if you think, oh, I'm going to ramp this person up to
yeah.
100% velocity, probably won't get there.
Yeah. No, that's really cool. And I think that's, it's helpful for people to know why they're doing it, just another, it adds to how they execute. And that was one other thing I think we'll dive into exercise selection a little bit more next week, like specifically exercise selection.
Mm-hmm.
But with, I think everything that we've mentioned so far and the reasons that I choose what I choose, most of the time it's either making it easier to do it the right way or making it really hard to do it the wrong way.
Yeah.
And that sounds like it's exactly, if you don't do it the right way, you're going to kick hurdles left, right, and center, on this
Yeah.
one.
So you put this constraint, the person goes, I don't want to kick or touch the hurdles.
Yeah.
And they change how they run accordingly.
Mm-hmm.
And it puts them in a good spot.
Cool. That's really cool.
So
yeah, I think that's a nice way to wrap up.
Yeah.
The athlete assessment, I think, is what we called it.
I learned a lot today. There's a lot of things you talked about I didn't know.
Yeah, same.
As someone who has people squatting or deadlifting or benching from time to time, good thing to probably know.
Yeah, well, yeah, same. And yeah, a lot of things about sprinting that I've never heard of, and more tools in the toolbox for sure.
Exactly. So hopefully everybody out there too has at least a few things you take away. And you go, okay, I'm going to play around with this. I'm going to try this. Let's see how it works.
Yeah. I think I used the same transition last time, but another tool in the toolbox is music.
Music is always in the toolbox.
Yeah. I couldn't think of a better transition.
It never leaves.
Yeah. Yeah. What have you been listening to lately?
Rob Zombie.
Have you been? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I was listening to a lot of Rob Zombie over the last little while. And White Zombie too. He was the lead for the band White Zombie. And then he did his solo stuff, but his stuff is just so catchy. It's metal, but it's almost got this like groovy element to it. This groovy, vibey element to it.
I've never heard of either of those. I think I've heard of Rob Zombie, but I've never listened to it. So that'll be one I have to check out because a groovy metal sounds interesting.
Yeah, that's the best way I could describe it. Like there's definitely like there's, distortion guitars and there's all that good stuff that, metal often has. And he's a big horror movie fan. So horror movie and metal just kind of go together like peanut butter and jelly. So it's got that sort of dark, mysterious, heavy element to it. But yeah, I don't know how to describe it other than like it's kind of got this groovy kind of vibe to it. So, helps you lift heavy because it is heavy, but then it keeps you going because it's kind of got this vibe and groove to it. That's good. That's so nice. That's been sort of the big change of course this week. I was like, oh yeah, randomly had a Rob Zombie song come up on a playlist and I was like, man, his stuff is so catchy. And then down the rabbit hole you go. Done.
Yeah. That's kind of how it went for me too, actually. Like I was listening to like Rise Against and, some Green Day and things like that, a week or two ago. And then a Billy Talent song came up on the playlist and I was like, oh yeah, I really love Billy Talent. So then that's the rabbit hole I've been in lately.
Nice.
And just listening to, everything. I love all of their stuff.
I don't know if is there a song by them that's like, this isn't very good? Like,
no,
everything seems to be good. They're just a good band.
Yeah. And they have like a few new songs, like new this year songs, which is also very cool that I hadn't heard before this week.
Yeah, because I think they just came out with a new album, didn't they? Within the last 6 months or something, or a year.
Maybe. Yeah. They had Afraid of Heights. I don't know if that's what you're thinking of. That came out like maybe 2 years ago, I think.
No, this is Reckless Paradise, I think.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
wrong, someone's going to roast me in the comment section for sure, but I
Yeah.
think it's Reckless Paradise.
So from what I can tell, that album is not entirely out yet, but they've released maybe like 4 or 5 singles from it.
They're good though, because I've heard some of them.
Oh,
It's
they're
like, man,
very
that's
good.
Billy Talent.
They're very good. So yeah, I've been jamming out to that in the gym when I've been doing my work, which is not a great thing because I sing along.
We all do.
And I've got all my CDs in the car, and I'm just going one by one through the CDs right now, which
That's sick.
is nice. Yeah,
That's sick.
yeah, yeah.
I,
Well,
I
think
can't
that's
disagree with that selection. Billy Talent, 100%. I
mm-hmm,
can get behind that.
mm-hmm, definitely. Well, I think that wraps up today.
Yeah, a longer one, but a lot of good info, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, hey man, I learned a lot from you today. There's things
Yeah.
I haven't heard, so this is a good episode. I think
Oh
I
yeah.
learned a lot. Hopefully, you
Yeah.
learned a lot.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. Yeah, probably my favorite episode to date, and
Yeah,
hopefully we just keep. Hopefully the next one is our favorite every time.
just keep bringing the bar up, right?
Climbing the ladder.
So yeah, and hopefully everyone else learned a lot today. Hopefully, everyone listening is taking something away that they can use in their coaching and their training,
Mm-hmm.
and try to get better.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully people that are listening decided to go watch it as well, so they can see some of the various hand
Demos.
motions that we were using to describe stuff.
Yeah, exactly. All sorts of weird things to show movement.
Yeah.
So
Mm-hmm. Well, that's it then. That was the fifth
episode, yeah.
episode. All right. Well, thanks for coming along, world. That was the Speed Strength Show. I'm Braden.
I'm Tommy, and we will see you next week. And thanks for listening.